Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're tackling a massive, multi-billion-dollar mystery. Why do so many well-funded, incredibly well-intentioned social programs completely fail to actually prove their worth? We're going to deconstruct exactly how organizations measure social impact and, more importantly, how they so often get it wrong. To do that, here's our roadmap. 1. The impact inflation trap. 2. 3 gaps in measurement. 3. The Scalers capability engine. 4. A case study on youth employability. And finally, 5. A better way to measure. Let's get to it. All right, section 1. The impact inflation trap. So here's a question for you right out of the gate. Are we measuring activity or are we measuring impact? It sounds like just a tiny semantic difference, but honestly, this definitional gap is where almost everyone in the social enterprise space trips up in the real world. Let's compare simple outputs, say 500 people trained, to actual impact, which would be 500 lives truly transformed. It's kind of like a giant iceberg. The easily counted outputs, like the number of classes held or people enrolled, well, that's just the visible tip of the iceberg. But the actual sustained impact, that remains hidden deep beneath the surface. And when systems conflate the two, they fall straight into the impact inflation trap. They end up making inflated claims and taking on massive reputational risks just because they mistake implementation progress for actual performance. Which brings us to section 2, 3 gaps in measurement. So measuring impact isn't just hard. It's actually structurally flawed across 3 specific gaps. First up is the definition gap. You know how organizations love to use those vague, buzzword-heavy words, things like empower or transform or increase well-being, but without strict boundaries, like exactly who benefits, for how long, and compared to what baseline. Those statements are basically just performative. If you don't have an operational definition of impact, your measurement system just defaults to whatever is easy to standardize, rather than what's actually decision useful. Then we have the monitoring gap. This is a critical failure mode where organizations track administrative steps instead of sustained outcomes. Honestly, it's kind of like a restaurant bragging about how many ovens they turned on, rather than whether the food actually tastes good. And worse, a lot of early-stage ventures avoid setting baselines entirely because they feel it's just too academic. But the harsh reality is, without a baseline, any value for money or growth claims you make down the road are completely unverifiable. You just end up flying blind on unreliable, self-reported data that can't even be benchmarked. Finally, the evaluation gap. Look, real life is incredibly messy. Beneficiaries are facing multiple, simultaneous external influences, everything from family context to massive shifts in the broader economy. And because of this complex causality, those naive, simple pre- and post-comparisons often over-attribute results directly to the program itself. Plus, there are time lags. By the time you actually evaluate the long-term impact, the data usually arrives way too late to be a useful management tool for today. There's a really powerful quote from our source material that perfectly sums this up. Focus remains on financial inputs and outputs rather than results. I mean, that really highlights a systemic failure, right? We're out here tracking mere activity and short-term delivery instead of the sustained, long-term outcomes that actually change people's lives. So how do we fix this? Let's move to section 3, the Scalers capability engine. The Scalers model is a framework of 7 organizational capabilities that determine whether a social enterprise can scale and sustain its impact. And make no mistake, the big takeaway here is that scaling impact is absolutely not just about growing your organizational size or reaching more people. It's entirely about deploying these specific strategic capabilities to ensure your intervention is designed well, delivered well, and most importantly, can endure over time. Let's break down the first half of this acronym. S is for staffing, so attracting and retaining the right people. C is communicating, persuading stakeholders and building that crucial social legitimacy. A is alliance building, forming networks and partnerships. And L is lobbying, influencing policy and institutions. These 4 traits are literally the internal gears that drive execution. Because, look, you can have an absolutely excellent mission, but without these execution capabilities, well, your impact is really just an intent.
Now, the second half is just as critical. E is earnings generation, creating sustainable financial resources. R is replicating your model across different contexts. And S is stimulating market forces to shape demand for social solutions. I really want to emphasize earnings generation here. Economic performance isn't about putting profit over purpose, not at all. It's the essential fuel that gives your capability engine its endurance and its reach. It gives you the runway you need to survive long enough for your complex outcomes to actually materialize.
All right, let's see this in action. Section 4, Case Study, Youth Employability. Here is a specific measurable impact pathway for youth skills startup. It goes 1. Career coaching, which leads to 2. Employer matching, then 3. Job placement, and finally 4. Employment retention. Following this exact pathway proves a major point. Real impact is a multi-stage journey. It is not just a day one hiring event. Measurement absolutely must follow these chains step by step, rather than just jumping naively from, say, a coaching session straight to claiming you've achieved impact. And this brilliantly illustrates why you need both sides of the equation. Think about it. Without matching, career coaching alone leaves youth with poor choices and no real job access, which leads to weak outcomes. But with matching, you get clear direction and a structured entry into the labor market. So career coaching overcomes the individual skill constraints, while employer matching breaks down the systemic barriers and reduces perceived hiring risk. They act as perfectly complementary forces. But how do you actually know if this pathway resulted in true impact? 3 to 6 months. Emphasize that number. Measuring job retention at the 3 to 6 month mark is the absolute strongest indicator of a true match. Sure, a short-term placement can happen randomly, but retention proves true job fit. If they're still employed half a year later, well, that metric leaves simple output-based activity tracking in the dust. Okay, let's bring it all together. Section 5, a better way to measure. When we compare traditional frameworks, you really start to see the limitations. The balanced scorecard? Great for internal management performance, but it totally ignores long-term systemic impact. Social return on investment monetizes social value, but it relies heavily on proxy assumptions that can really oversimplify complex realities. Cost-benefit analysis looks at aggregate economic efficiency, but ignores distributional inequality, meaning it doesn't really account for who actually benefits. And the UN SDGs are fantastic for global goal alignment, but they're just too broad for a single enterprise to track effectively. So they each capture a fraction of the reality, but structurally they lack integration. So what's the answer? It's an integrated measurement solution. This uses a theory of change to map the specific causal pathways. It uses scalers to measure those vital organizational scaling capabilities. It uses econometrics, meaning data-driven, empirical validation to counter those complex causality issues. And finally, tiered indicators which balance daily operational outputs with those long-term, hard-to-measure impacts. This hybrid framework is a game changer because it perfectly connects the micro-level capabilities of an organization with the macro-level transformations they're actually trying to achieve. I'll leave you with this powerful mic drop synthesis directly from our source material. Impact equals results. Scaling impact equals capabilities. That cements the core takeaway of this entire explainer. You can't just track what you do. You have to build the internal engine capable of sustaining and growing those results over time. Which brings us to our final provocative question. I want you to really think about your own organization right now. If you stopped counting activities today, no more tallying up sessions delivered or people enrolled, could you still prove your actual impact tomorrow? It's a tough question for sure, but shifting your focus from the visible tip of the iceberg to the massive, sustained change beneath the surface, that is exactly what's required to unlock true, scalable impact. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you measure.